Hello, this is Solène. Welcome to this Liftoff special edition, live from a Michelberger hotel room. I'm delighted to have as guests Jiordi Rosales and Aerin Dunford from the Emergence Network. The Emergence Network is, as we describe it, a research inquiry into the otherwise, a constellation of humans and non-humans working together translocally to create projects, rituals, and conversations. You both are co-curator of it, and a few months ago we had the incredible chance to interview Bayo Akomolafe, the initiator, and we were very keen on continuing the conversation around the themes of making sanctuary, entanglement, slowing down, and much more. So thank you so much, Aerin and Jiordi, for being with us. And perhaps to contextualize a little bit our conversation, you both together with Bayo are developing a wonderful course named We Will Dance with Montaigne, which from my point of view seems to be much more than a course. It seems to be a collective experience that spans from October to January, that includes lectures by Bayo Akomolafe, open discussions, exercises, one-on-one encounters, side events, and ongoing research. So the way that you've been describing this We Will Dance with Montaigne, Let Us Make Sanctuary, is to talk about fugitive and monsters, and to mention that they go through the cracks of their broken landscapes, they take on new shapes, they make sanctuary. So my first question to you would be, how do you become fugitives, and what means making sanctuary?
Well, I think it serves to maybe start with the story of sanctuary, because it means so many different things to different people. It's often glamorized or glorified or mythologized, and at the same time it is contradicting itself in so many circumstances, in all the ways that sanctuary has come to be offered, to be seeked out. And the way that I approach it is really through rupture. So maybe to start with the myth, the sanctuary that I often refer to in my work is the Oracle at Delphi, which was a sanctuary operating around 500 BCE up till now. It's still there. And it was basically discovered, the story goes, that Zeus was searching for the navel, the belly button of the earth. And so he sent an eagle from the west and from the east, and where they crossed over was where they decided would be the Oracle at Delphi. Simultaneously, there's this geological myth and happening of a seismic encounter at that point where the earth actually broke open. And that's what allowed for the cavern, which is where the sanctuary was made, to exist. And since then, people have been going into that cavern to receive divination, to escape the Roman Empire, and to be with their dreams, to actually encounter themselves more deeply. So sanctuary means all those things to me. It's not just a place of safety or protection, it's a place of breaking open, both the earth itself breaking open to allow for people to seek protection. But in that seeking of protection, people were forced themselves to break open to their dreams, to vision. It's a temple of Apollo, so it's very heavy in the dream work. Yeah, and people, they weren't ever really safe there necessarily. It didn't offer them invulnerability from the things that were seeking them. Rather, it exposed them to the cosmos, to the sky, to the prophecies that were coming in, and required people actually to undertake a journey in themselves of transformation, of metamorphosis through that dream work and through being in that space. So that's how we orient to sanctuary in the work that we're doing. especially in We Will Dance with Mountains, is that we're not necessarily offering people a safe place to find protection from all the dramas of the world, but rather a place to undergo a type of radical hospitality that will allow for and nurture their own metamorphosis, their own transformation of integrating the times that we're in and responding. Thanks.
Beautiful. I resonate so much with that amazing story about Delphi. And I think that the thing that most stands out for me, and I learned this from Bayo, is the tradition, right, in Northern Europe of the fugitive being able to seek sanctuary, which is something that's obviously been lost in our kind of heavily dependent on the penal system culture and tendencies in these times. But then there was this tradition that as a fugitive, and this was common knowledge, you could go to a place of sanctuary, which was often a church, and seek respite in your fleeing, in your trying to shapeshift in some way into something else. But in order to be able to pass through the door of the church, many times one had to grab onto a knocker that was often in the shape of a monster, a gargoyle, and for me, that's just so representative of this idea that we have to be willing to, as Jiordi said, break apart in order to pass through that door. And that isn't comfortable. So I think there's this piece about being willing to embrace the monster that's necessary and obviously quite terrifying, especially in our times that we live in now, where we feel so, I think there's such a dependence on security and knowing and certainty and science. And it's becoming very clear, I think, to many of us that those kinds of ways of thinking are no longer serving us. But it requires that we be willing to take that step across the threshold after grabbing the monster, embracing the monster, and see how we are transformed. And that requires us to let go of identities and certainties that we believe we had prior to that moment. So those are just a couple of things that come up for me. I think in terms of fugitivity as well, at the Emergence Network, we're working on a new little funding strategy that's very fugitive, which is an interesting thing to do, because usually trying to raise money is about getting visibility and being seen and followers, and we're trying to do this in the cracks. And so thinking about what if fugitives, how do we think like fugitives? You know, it requires that we cover our tracks, that we be very attentive to what's happening. You know, we can't plan. And I feel like as I look around the world right now, we really need to cultivate that capacity to see what's emerging rather than what we think should be happening. And so I think a fugitive has to be very attentive and has to be on his or her toes and be ready to change, you know, to adapt in any moment.
Wonderful, and I can see that in both your ways until now, both your path, you've been very much already exploring and contemplating the way to go as fugitives, in the sense of going, breaking the cracks through the cracks and following set approach such as Jiordi, what you've been doing in the realm of sonic experiences and ecology, Aerin around the communication and the rethinking leadership. It's all about first breaking down before seeing what can arise from this breakdown. And so when you look currently at how things are, and when you look at this approach to like break down the current credentialized research, for instance, and to instead, you've been very keen on assembling a large translocal agora of, as you name, fugitive researchers to explore some questions. What are some of these inquiries that you would like to, that you've been in the past already engaging, but with nowadays situation and nowadays questions, what are some of the inquiries that you wish to emulate?
So if you talk to Bayo, I'm sure that he will tell you how much I do not care for the word research. And I very much prefer the idea of inquiry or our questions or curiosity kind of compelling us forward to see what we can discover, what we can allow to come into our vision, what's already there that we're not seeing. And just by changing our perspective or changing our glasses, suddenly something new becomes visible to us. So the project that I'm curating, or one of the projects that I'm curating with the Emergence Network, is something called Kairos. And the name comes from this idea of a time out of time, this other concept of time. Whereas our Chronos time has a very clear linearity to it, controllable, predictable. Here we're kind of discovering what happens in spaces of shared hospitality that we maybe wouldn't be able to see in Chronos time if we were looking at everything through these linear glasses of development and growth. And Kairos is the kind of root of it has to do with radical hospitality. So we're inviting communities mostly that are working on, and I would say the margins. I think it's really just looking at the way that we're entangled with materiality. And I think that, one of the key threads that both runs through the Emergence Network and We Will Dance with Mountains is this concept of post-activism. And for me, at the heart of that inquiry is the question, what if the way that we're responding to the crisis is part of the crisis? So if I were to apply that to what if the way that I'm researching this is only reinforcing what I think I know? And how can we investigate, and how can we be an inquiry in a different way? That's maybe how I would bring those two pieces together of post-activism and research.
What about you, Jiordi? What does the post-activism mean to you, and how can we nurture it?
Yeah, I agree with everything Aerin said around first examining, what is it that brings us to an inquiry? Is it to create certainty for ourselves, or to make the world more knowable so that we can then seek to control more readily in our lives, which, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I think it's very reasonable to want to feel in control. However, the implications of that mastery have had dire consequences for the earth, for people, for science, for development. It's all really come to how do we dominate through our knowledge? How is white supremacy really playing out through our institutions and through the way that we ask questions? And we're curious through post-activism, which is important to name that it's not necessarily after activism, as if we thwarted that and it didn't work and now we're doing something different, but it's rather taking activism, saying thank you for all the work that folks are up to, and how do we introduce reflective opportunities to notice the ways that the very things that we're attempting to change have infiltrated our psyches, and that they're operating at these subconscious levels that are in many cases undermining our communities, undermining our actions, because we're replicating corporate models, or we're replicating progress or advancing through really these very capitalist structures. So when we say research, we're looking at how am I entangled with the thing that I want to change? How through intimate encounters with the world around me, with the physical structures that are housing me, where do I really sit? And when I do uncover these aspects of, say, capitalism or wanting power and wealth, what do I do then when I meet that part of me? and are there co-conspirators in the more than human world that want to work with me if I could listen to them for that liberation of not defeating the shadow of myself, but rather initiating something different to happen. And if you look at any of these moments where we've talked about sanctuary, whether it's the oracle at Delphi or seeking sanctuary in medieval Europe, there was always a yew tree planted as well at the entrance to these sanctuaries, along with the monster on the knocker. And the reasoning behind the yew tree, they were cultivated by the monks or the priests who were offering sanctuary. And they were even being tended in a way to be propagated and cut to make a bow, like a bow and arrow. So the fugitive would arrive, they couldn't be shot in there by whoever it was that was chasing them. Maybe they stole some sheep, I don't know. And they were granted the opportunity to work with this yew tree, cut a piece of wood and make a bow, and then they would disappear into the forest. You look at, the work of Harriet Tubman, which was all about ecological literacy and cosmic literacy, of being able to read the stars, read the tides, read tracks, deep listening, in order to navigate and bring people to liberation. We even read, my partner Branti and I were looking at this book of tides the other day that was, it was re-examining the story of Moses and the Exodus, which was that Moses actually had an ecological literacy of reading the tides to know, because he lived there deeply and was embedded in that landscape, to know when the tide was going to go out, to expose this spit of land that ran across the Red Sea. And in that doing, he knew that Pharaoh, who lived way inland, wouldn't know that. How could he? And he knew they would chase them with chariots. And so there are these moments of when people do really seek sanctuary and really initiate something else to happen through their fugitive act. It's always ecological. It's always in this collaborative thinking and acting with the world around them, which to me is one of the first interruptions of post-activism, which is to be that my thoughts are not my thoughts alone. My liberation does not belong to me alone, and I will not get there by myself. So how do we really instigate these opportunities to listen in other ways? And it comes with just deep attention. It comes with pausing, with slowing down, and being willing to be surprised by what we learn.
I might just add onto that very quickly, the We Will Dance with Mountains course, the research thread of it is really to take some of these ideas and put them into practice. The research thread is called the Bakita Project. And the idea is to understand, what does making sanctuary actually feel like? What does it taste like? What is it in these times? So I think that that's just really important to bring that together with this community of people over 4 months. We'll be diving deeply into this idea of what is making sanctuary, from some of these new perspectives.
Mm-hmm. And so for you, these questions are not so new as it may be for a lot of students joining. How have you been experiencing in the past, or trying to experience this reconnection? Because ultimately it seems, and that's exactly what you say, Jiordi, in terms of our approach, which is always ecological, also in the sense that there is this disconnect that we on all fronts realize that no longer doesn't make sense, and also definitely no longer serves us if it at any point of time served us. So how can we practically, or how have you been experiencing this reconnection with the thriving life, with our, some would name it environment, which are, you know, also very sterile worlds, but how are we connected back to what we belong to, this oneness that we all can experience?
Well, I might just take that and share a few. Since the beginning of this year, the Emergence Network, which is a small group of people, you know, we're 11 curators spread across the world. And we, after our first in-person gathering in Chennai, India, decided to do these post-activist experiments, translocal experiments, because it is easy sometimes to get caught in the beauty and the newness or the surprise of the ideas. And then I have felt, anyway, this great disconnect between my day-to-day life and being on Zoom calls and navigating budgets and raising funds and these ideas. And so we challenged ourselves to actually do practices. And I think that for me, the invitation is for people to look to their lives with a broader eye. And I think we also need to really expand ideas of what nature is. And so one of the experiments that we did was to really live side by side with an object that might be considered inanimate, and definitely something that we wouldn't say is nature, to see how that being, that non-sentient being, is alive, right? So my partner, who's also part of the Emergence Network, this was his companion for some months. And it sounds crazy, and I know this, right? I think we have to be willing to be a little bit crazy if we're going to do some of these experiments, but to converse with this, you know, to be in dialogue with something that we as human beings in our sort of anthropocentric way of seeing things think, oh, this has no intelligence, but what if it did? Another experiment was to create a shrine to the trouble. So Donna Haraway's beautiful saying, you know, to stay with the trouble. And so we created little altars related to some trouble in our lives, whether that was homelessness or I worked with a number of women here in Mexico that have been disappeared. And rather than jumping into the savior mode, what would it look like if we were just to sit and just to be with that trouble, to allow it to also be? So those are a couple of ideas of things that people might want to try. Pretty practical.
Yeah, I love those experiments. And I think that everything that we're saying about post-activism, it might sound new and like this whole other thing, but really it's a returning to very old ways of being in the world that are tuned into other forms of listening seasonally, to actually ask questions of the world around us, and to decentralize intelligence from the human, and to really acknowledge what I know and what I'm seeking to know might not come from the places that institutions have taught me is where power is. And so it's a political act to ask those questions. I love, was that a bouncy ball that Yayo was? You had said my partner, but then you lifted up the ball, so I thought maybe the rubber ball was your partner that you were referring to.
It's a bouncy ball that has no bounce, so it's got to be in some kind of existential crisis. You know?
That's hard. That's a hard one. And Aerin had brought up this word Kairos, which I feel really sits at the center of the Emergence Network and We Will Dance with Mountains, and a lot of the work that we're doing, which is it's a way of being in the world. Kairos, you know, was first written in the Iliad as the moment that an arrow strikes its target, dealing a mortal wound. So already we're back into this rupture, this opening. And then since, and before then, but especially since, through the ways that folks in the so-called Middle East and North Africa, Greece, were governing themselves for many thousands of years was based on Kairos. It was based on divine timing, of noticing that things don't happen in isolation, but that they're constantly impacting one another and cycling again and mirroring. And so people thought, well, if we can really give our attention to the stars and to the world and the events that are happening, give really deep attention, we might start to notice when things work well or when they go terribly. And are there patterns that are trackable? So people really became trackers of the world around them. And then we're making decisions based on that. And it wasn't just, you know, what did this person say to another person? It was, what did the clouds do? What did, what did the harvest do? What did the trees do? Did they drop their leaves on time? If they didn't, why? So when we're speaking about Kairos, or we're speaking about, these interruptions of ourselves and our patterns of thought, we're really just asking, how do we pay a different kind of attention? And that prophecy, which is at the basis of Kairos, is being able to receive message or indication of what's going to happen because it's happened before. It's not a single person's job. For one, Kairos is happening all the time. And it's rather, to me, it's a quality of attention, to notice those threads, to do it communally. Again, that prophecy doesn't come through one person, but comes through collective and comes through interactions and relationships, both between people and with the world around them. And that once we can really start to foster that attention to when things work well and when they don't, why, what do signs mean, then we're automatically thinking differently. We're automatically post-human, in the actual meaning of that term, which is to realize that human is at once more than human. Yeah.
Wow, wonderful.
So that's what we're hoping through this course to instigate in people, is just that quality of attention and way of being in the world. That I think offers other kinds of opportunities and exchanges in people's experience.
And so talking about this deep attention, which I think is fascinating, you, for instance, Jiordi, you've been exploring a lot sonic ecology. Can you tell us more about that and what have been some of the research threads that you have been developing?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, I love birds. That's the first, the first note. And the way that birds, through something called bird language, which has been practiced by indigenous people all over the world, is a way of noticing that, for when those threads are happening, those relationships between cause and effect and cycles are happening, and that other animals are talking about it. It isn't something that we have to, as humans, do alone, but rather listen to the ways that other beings have kairotic attention, have that level of deep, disciplined responsivity. And so birds, through their calling, through their alarming, their singing, are explaining to us actually quite clearly everything that's happening in the ecology around us, whether there's food, there's a predator, there's other weather coming. And if we can tune into that web of relationships, then we start to notice things that maybe we wouldn't notice if we were, say, sitting just in our living room drinking our tea. You could drink your tea outside too. And so when I speak to sonic ecology, I'm speaking to all the indicators through sound that invite us into a sensuous experience of the world. especially beyond the visual field, which often dominates our experience of what's happening around us. And so the work I'm doing now is about really listening to that as an indicator of the health of a place, and how might we learn from what's happening through sound to actually teach us how to respond, how to actually heal with land. And there's a methodology called tomatis, which is used for to work with different forms of hearing, to work with people who have anxiety. A lot of the work is with folks who are pregnant. And it's basically saying everyone hears differently, and our neural synapses all function differently, and we're hearing different frequencies from one another. So my voice to me sounds very different than the way that you're hearing it. And that when we have trauma, it often takes the place of missing frequencies that we can't hear. And Tomatis is grounding that in things that happened when we were in utero. And so we start to see, okay, if I'm missing this frequency, are there ways to remember that? And there are different methodologies they use to bring that about. Sonic ecology is doing the same thing, which is birds have evolved to all inhabit different ranges of frequencies, so that when they're all singing a dawn chorus together, they're harmonizing, and they're not walking over one another. They're creating a full sonic experience of themselves. They're singing together. And if the land has been hurt, some of those birds will be missing because maybe a food source is no longer there. So we start to listen to, like, what are the missing pieces of this landscape through sound, and then from that place, how do we respond? Which could easily be brought into a very scientific approach, which is a strong human tendency, I would say, to, like, okay, we'll surveil this land, we'll record every conversation that the birds have, and then we'll, from that, know what they want and give them what they want. But rather, what I think the invitation here is to really enter into a critical form of listening to what is the range of song here? How do we listen for what's missing? And then when we find what's missing, that probably has many, many implications, not just a missing tree, but actually is going to be related to when's the last time a fire came through here? When's the last time the rain came? Are we getting the same water here that we used to get? And so sonic ecology to me is really about expanding our relationship and our sensitivity to a place to include the invisible, the things that we can't see.
I always learn so much when I listen to you, Jiordi. I love it.
I mean, if you want to talk about birds, we'll talk about birds. I'm here for it.
Birds in Alaska, you have to tell us if there is any. Yeah, I think ultimately what you mentioned, or what we have been seeing, is that all of this approach and domination of a certain way to look at knowledge, for instance, is to have a science-based, very strong science-based knowledge in modern societies. While we see that in many parts of the world, and for a very long time, we had different type of knowledges that were complementing each other. And ultimately, it seems that we've been losing or trying to deplete over the time all of these different, not only sources of knowledge, but also these different approaches to gain knowledge. So in our post-COVID-19 world, with all of this, the potentiality that this crisis brings to us, in the sense that we finally have time to reflect on situations that we never have dared thinking of, how can we bring back these different approaches to knowledge?
Aerin, maybe you could speak to some of what you're learning through Kairos with the communities that you've been working with and how they're coming to approach that question.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I think there's so many different ways to answer that question. And I do think that we are in a moment of some possibility. I tend not to be a huge optimist, but it does feel like there's something cracking open here right now, both as things collapse, as they clearly are in so many different domains, but also as people have this moment to really step back from the hamster wheel of their lives and take a look at what's important. And I think that, so the first thing that came to mind was sort of, and this connects with our work with Kairos and the communities. Right now, the pilot of this project is taking place, well, it's taking place on Zoom, but the communities are in Brazil, all over Sao Paulo, and in Bogota, Colombia, and also Mexico, where I live. And I think what we can do is we can turn our gaze, we can try to tune our attention to places that have been resilient and that have been generating their own power and their own forms of deep relationship and connecting, you know, whether that's through food, urban gardening, feeding each other, creating art together. So music is a big theme. And then communication, so community radios, and how are we making sure that within our neighborhoods and the favelas and the barrios, that really people are getting the information that's crucial, as opposed to fake news, which I think for some of us who kind of live in different strata, whether that's class or race, or we're living in a less urban place, it may not be that big of a deal. But I remember one of the collaborators in Kairos said, you know, for us in Brazil, in this favela where we live, fake news is killing us, you know, because this information, you know, it creates a basis for false and dangerous actions. So if we turn to those favelas and those barrios cicatrices, like the scar neighborhoods, as they call them, and we look at the resilience that they've been cultivating over many, 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 many years, and seeing that they live outside of the places where we normally would look to when it comes to power, knowledge, authority, truth, we can learn a lot. And so I think that's what we're up to in creating the possibilities that they have interchange with each other. Because I do think that it's really important that we be careful about some of our assumptions about places like Nua or Ramirez, that are these communities that we're partnering with. And I feel like when we were kind of at the peak of development, when we really thought like we're going to bring this whole planet up to speed with the Western nations and modernize and develop, there was this sense of charity, of pity toward those places, like, oh, those poor people who have no money, or they have no light, or they have no education. And now, as we start to see how all of those systems are actually quite damaging to our well-being as human beings and as you know, a planet and as a whole, I think there's tending to be more eyes on those kinds of neighborhoods and those kinds of communities. But I feel like we have to be very careful also not to romanticize and not to essentialize, and realize how hard and how difficult life is in these places. And at the same time, there's just this deep sense of resilience and connectedness to each other. It's beautiful, and I feel so privileged and honored to be able to see that, to be witness to that, because I am also entangled there. I am also caught up with their stories and with their day-to-day lives. So creating these spaces for exchange, and opening to the possibility that there are other places of power. You know, we don't have to continue to depend on what we've thought of as the almighty power of the state or of capital. We can depend on each other. So it's a really beautiful experience for me. It's a very slow process, as time is different there. And then the other thing that I was going to say is we can turn to our myths, you know, and so I think that one of the things that I love about the Emergence Network and working with Jiordi and working with Bayo is like how frequently they turn to these stories, right? And cultivating and weaving in the mythopoetic into our lives again can bring us so much, you know, and it's like, as Jiordi was saying, like, this isn't new. We just have to turn to look at where this has happened before, you know. And that, I guess at the end, what I want to say is that none of this is easy and none of this is without some pain. And so I think we can also essentialize and romanticize this idea of fugitivity. Who wants to be in this system that we're in right now? Let's get out, you know, but recognizing that shape-shifting and transforming is deeply painful. And so we also have to cultivate our capacity to stay with that discomfort, to stay with the not knowing. And I think it's harder than we realize in our modern times to do that.
Yeah, Bayo will often use this term like going fugitive, which can mean so many things. And I think to each person, there's an invitation there to explore, okay, like middle class, middle-aged white woman wanting to become fugitive. What does that look like for you? And many of the people who sign up for the course will probably have that as, you know, there's going to be people of all shapes and sizes and class differences, racial differences. So, you know, we're anticipating that will instigate some trouble. And then there's very real occurrences of it. Like a man I used to live with, Watani, who escaped from San Quentin prison and actually was a fugitive and went to South America and had to hide. So how do we really keep these terms and these aspirations grounded in the reality of the world and the pain and the racism and the imperialism that fugitivity has been caused by? So not to be pretty about it. And to me, you know, it really comes down to the way that we communicate with one another, because the way we speak, the words we use, the mediums through which we converse with one another have to change. There are going to be things, there are going to be ways that we need to speak to each other and listen to each other that are different than what we're taught. So how, for me, if people want to cultivate fugitivity in themselves, sanctuary in themselves, to take on the work of learning new languages, not just verbally, but through like pattern language, being able to read signs, being able to synchronize with one another across distance. How can I get to the point where I know what Aerin needs without her needing to ask me for it? And what if our internet connection, I'm in Alaska, Aaron's in Oaxaca, how do we, what if our internet connection isn't good, but it's really essential that we do something in alignment with one another? So when we're talking about fugitivity, we're talking about cultivating that ability to listen deeply and to know when to act. And the phrase I really lean on these days is to be legible to each other and illegible to the state. So how do we speak languages, communicate with one another in ways that capitalism or whatever it is that is watching cannot follow us, because that would require them to undergo transformation themselves. So really looking for those forms in how we communicate and how we teach one another and how we run online courses via Zoom and otherwise that will require that of people is really essential.
Yeah, often I think when it comes to shifting the way that we communicate, and as you say, truly rethinking the way that we listen. It comes also to the baseline of the notion of service, which goes a bit beyond or one step back before communicating. It's what is the lens, what is the ear that you are having for each other? Is it an ear that will put service to humanity at the center, or not? And it's not only listening to each other, but it's also, as you say, listening to nature, listening to all elements around us. And we have been seeing more and more this disconnect towards being at the service of each other. We tend to we expect from cities to serve the citizens, we expect from governments to serve, which are ultimately these entities where everybody should be serving each other, but also serving the non-humans around us. So perhaps as a last question, I would love to hear from you around that specific aspect of service, which ultimately seems also to transpire a lot in the We Will Dance with Montaigne, where you are bringing this incredible service of creating this agora around the world, bringing hundreds of people together to rethink, to allow for rupture, to see what's gonna come, to welcome the pain, which I think is something that I find so marvelous from you as a team, as a support, is to actually allow for discomfort, which is also something that so many entities, private, publics, are not ready to do. So what can we do to nurture a different type of or a different understanding of service around us?
Wow, that's quite a question. And the first thing that came to mind, making that bridge between communication and service, I'm not a professional interpreter, but I work with a number of people who do interpretation in spoken language and sign language. And one of the things that I've learned from that community that they have very clear is that when you're playing that role, you're of service to the message. So if you're interpreting in a legal situation or something like that, it's so important that you're not taking sides, right? So I just find that interesting. And what would it look like? I often think of us as translators or interpreters. And that may be what we're called to do here, is to, as we listen out in new ways, as we put on new glasses, as we are attentive, we may need to serve in the role of interpreters. And what would that look like? I think that's a fascinating question. And then what I will say and answer this question is, so we have received many hundreds of applications for the course, and having read them all, I would say that the single largest pattern of what questions people are asking is how to be of service. I mean, I couldn't even tell you how many times people are asking, and I think in this particular epoch of time, just people want to know how their lives can contribute to something bigger. And I feel like it's a very individual journey. I think that definitely creating and there's also a lot of gratitude and appreciation for the creation of this space. And I have a great deal of respect for my brother Bayo for being so courageous to create this, because there aren't many other spaces like this in the world, I think. And it definitely comes with risk. It's fraught with trouble. And at the same time, it feels like a worthwhile inquiry, investigation, journey. And I think the last thing that I'll say about this question is, and again, it comes back to a theme we've been talking about this entire interview, around shifting our way of seeing ourselves or situating ourselves in this greater milieu of, everything, not only the ecosystem, not only nature, not only our communities, but the more than human, the ancestors, the stories that make us. And instead of thinking, what can I do, or how can I be of service, I feel like there's this question of like, how can I open myself so that something may come through me? And so much of it for me has to do with decentering our human agency, because this way that we've been thinking about things is that humans have it all figured out. If we just get smarter and smarter and we get better and better science, we're going to be fine. And there's this huge step that I feel like is being invited. And I think that COVID-19 is a great catalyst for this. Here's this element that we can't see. We just know it's out there. How is that changing us? What is that opening in us? And so instead of us asking, what can we do? I would say the question is, what is wanting to be done to us?
Amen. Yeah, thank you for that question. And saying that we're of service, it makes me realize that I don't receive that too often as part of the Emergence Network. People don't say like, wow, y'all are of such great service to the world. More often it looks like, oh, we're troublemakers, or we're tricksters, or we're stirring the pot. So thank you for witnessing that as something that serves. And I really see our work, what we're in service to in many ways is, has to do with decomposition, has to do with being death doulas to the world and the way that we've come to make sense of the times that we're in. So we're here to support that dying process generatively, and asking like, okay, we're in demise. What does that mean to each of us? What kind of intelligence, what kind of new questions, what imagination can come through people in that state of descent, in that catabasis, that this word I've come across of going down together. And I think with We Will Dance with Mountains, it is going to be a descent. And it will in many cases be painful, it'll be beautiful, it'll be funny. And I love that people have been asking, as they enter into this journey, how do they serve? Which is a perpetual question, an infinite question that must change every day, because service is not static. Needs are constantly arising and falling. So, we're in service by asking and listening, what serves today? How do I make a beneficial impact where I am today? And I think post-activism, because of the name, often gets put into this theoretical arena, or like purely reflective or purely in dialogue. But we're really here for action, even though we want it to be slow, we want it to be responsive, and for it to, even in itself, inhabit its own complexity, its contradiction. But we do need people who are showing up, and really serving right now, and asking how to do that through a critical lens. And yeah, I think ultimately, as the Emergence Network, it often looks like death doula-ship and transition work for now. That feels true.
I might just quickly add on to that, because this was a aha moment for me when Bayo shared just at the beginning of this year that post-activism actually his original term was compost activism, which continues to be very much alive in me. And I think it's like, as Jiordi was saying, how do we accompany processes of decomposition? And somebody asked me in another interview recently, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a death doula or to accompany a process or what happens, And I don't think we really know. I feel that we have to, learn some different ways of seeing in order to understand what that looks like. But I know from my composting toilet here outside of my window that there are a few things that happen. One is that energy is released, right? So it's like, instead of trying to constantly battle against what we don't want, or even let's construct the utopia, and then how do we take steps toward that? What does it look like to be deeply embedded and immersed in the process of things falling apart? And energy comes. And I think that's been my experience with the Emergence Network, with many of the experiments that we've done together up until now. And then the other thing that comes out of compost is something that nurtures and something that gives life. And I don't know if that's the case here. I think there's probably many different, there's probably a lot of different things that are generated through the process of decomposition, but it feels like something that nourishes us comes out of that process.
Beautiful. Well, thank you both so much. I think we reached the 60 minutes to lift off. So we're gonna definitely leave you with a lot of inspiration and some things that are already floating in our minds, such as deep attention, learning new pattern languages, and what is wanted to be done to us. So thank you so much again. And we are very much looking forward to taking part of the class very soon.
Thank you. And registration is still open despite the flow of applications. So if folks are hearing this and they want to participate, we welcome that.
And the website is course.bayoakomolafe.net, which I'm sure we can have somewhere in the show notes. Yeah.
Exactly. We're going to link that. And very much looking forward to the wonderful conversations.
It will be an adventure.